The metal bucket handle bites into calloused palms as dawn breaks over the camp perimeter. A woman in her 30s, skeletal thin beneath a dress patched 17 times, grips the handle with both hands. Her knuckles are white. The bucket weighs 40 pounds when filled, nearly half her current body weight. Behind her, a line of women stretches toward the single working pump, their shadows long and brittle in the early light. The wet season has turned the campgrounds into sucking mud, and each step toward the barracks is a calculated negotiation between momentum and collapse. No one speaks. Speaking wastes calories they cannot spare. For 3 years and 2 weeks, these women have carried water. They have carried it through dysentery epidemics that killed 37 prisoners in a single August week. They have carried it through the sweltering Manila heat that turns the corrugated iron barracks into ovens by noon. They have carried it past Japanese guards who watch with expressions that reveal nothing and sometimes everything. The act of carrying water has become more than survival. It has become the architecture of their captivity, the daily liturgy that marks them as defeated, as property, as organisms barely worth the resources required to keep them breathing. 3 miles away, American tanks are rolling through the northern suburbs of Manila. The women do not know this yet. They know only buckets and mud and the precise angle required to keep water from sloshing over the rim and wasting on ground that drinks everything and gives nothing back. The story of Santo Tomas and dozens of camps like it across the Pacific Theater is not simply a tale of liberation. It is a chronicle of collision between two entirely incompatible philosophies of human value, played out in gestures so small they barely registered in official military reports. When American forces finally breached the gates of these camps in early 1945, they brought with them something far more subversive than superior firepower. They brought a casual, almost thoughtless assumption that a woman struggling with a water bucket deserved help. Not because she had earned it, not because military protocol demanded it, but simply because she was struggling and they could help. This assumption, embedded deep in the American psyche by decades of democratic idealism and frontier egalitarianism, would prove more devastating to Japanese military ideology than any bombing campaign. Because in that moment when an American soldier reached for a bucket handle without thinking, without ceremony, without establishing hierarchy or obligation, in that instant the entire edifice of Bushido honor culture trembled. The Japanese Imperial Army had spent decades constructing a military philosophy built on absolute hierarchy. Every interaction was precisely calibrated along vertical lines of power. Superiors commanded, inferiors obeyed. Prisoners existed outside this structure entirely, not at the bottom of the hierarchy, but beyond it, in a realm where the rules of human treatment no longer applied. To be captured was to cease existing as a person worthy of consideration. This was not cruelty for its own sake. This was ideology made operational. Japanese soldiers themselves had been conditioned through brutal training regimens that stripped away individualism. The Seishin Kyoiku, spiritual education, emphasized that the soldier's body belonged to the emperor. Personal comfort, personal dignity, personal survival were bourgeois Western concepts that weakened martial spirit. Junior soldiers were routinely beaten by their superiors, not as punishment but as education. They learned to accept suffering as proof of dedication. They learned that to complain was to admit weakness. They learned that hierarchy was the universe's natural state. When these soldiers became camp guards, they brought this philosophy intact. The prisoners at Santo Tomas, 3,785 civilians at the camp's peak, including women, children, and elderly missionaries who had spent their lives serving Filipino communities, existed in a category the Japanese military system had no framework to process. They were not combatants, but they were not innocents either. They were extensions of the Western imperial powers that Japan was trying to expel from Asia. Their suffering was not a moral problem requiring solution. It was simply a fact, like weather. By January 1945, the average adult female prisoner at Santo Tomas weighed 93 pounds. The camp diet provided approximately 960 calories per day, less than half what the human body requires to maintain basic function. The Japanese authorities had calculated this figure precisely. It was enough to prevent mass starvation that might draw international attention. It was not enough for health, dignity, or hope. The women had learned to move slowly to conserve energy. They had learned which wild greens growing along the camp perimeter were edible and which caused cramping. They had learned to trade embroidered handkerchiefs to Filipino contacts beyond the fence for contraband cans of sardines that could mean the difference between slow starvation and slightly slower starvation. They had learned to carry water. In the world outside the wire, the war was collapsing inward on Japan. American forces had retaken most of the Pacific Islands. The Philippines campaign was grinding toward Manila. Japanese supply lines were severed. The guards at Santo Tomas had not been paid in 4 months. Food shipments to the camp had become irregular, then scarce, then nearly non-existent. By early January, the camp kitchen was serving lugao, a watery rice gruel so thin that prisoners joked they could read through it. 200 grams of this substance constituted a meal. The guards grew tense. Some disappeared entirely, slipping away into the chaos of Manila's defense preparations. Others became erratic, their faces tight with the knowledge that defeat was approaching and they would be held accountable. The camp commandant, a lieutenant colonel who had once prided himself on maintaining order, spent his days burning documents in an oil drum behind the administrative building. Smoke rose in a thin gray column. Everyone could smell paper turning to ash. American tanks from the 1st Cavalry Division's 44th Tank Battalion smashed through the entrance at 9:00 p.m. on February 3rd, several hours after sunset. The lead Sherman tank commander, Lieutenant Abner Schwerin, would later report that he had expected resistance. Instead, he found prisoners running toward the tanks, screaming, weeping, some collapsing in the mud from the effort of running. It took 23 minutes to secure the camp. The Japanese guards, outnumbered and aware that the entire American division was behind this vanguard, surrendered after brief negotiations. Some prisoners would later say that the guards looked relieved. The American soldiers who poured through the gates that night, young men from Iowa and Texas and Oregon, most of them no older than 23, had been briefed on what to expect. They knew about internment camps. They knew about malnutrition. They knew in the abstract way that intelligence briefings convey information that conditions would be poor. Nothing prepared them for the reality. A sergeant from the 44th Tank Battalion, whose name appears in after-action reports only as Kowalski J., wrote in a letter home that the prisoners looked like walking skeletons dressed in rags. He described women whose hair had turned white, though many were barely 40. He described children with distended bellies and stick-thin limbs. He described the smell, a compound of unwashed bodies, open latrines, tropical rot, and despair. He described standing next to his tank, his rifle hanging useless at his side, watching a woman his mother's age kneel in the mud and kiss his boots. He picked her up. The instinct was automatic. She weighed nothing. This was the first collision. Not the liberation itself, but this gesture of lifting without thinking. This assumption that a woman on her knees required assistance, required dignity, required the basic human acknowledgement that her position was wrong and should be corrected. Within hours, the camp transformed into organized chaos. Medical personnel arrived, food supplies rolled in. American soldiers, many of them fresh from combat, still wearing mud-caked uniforms and carrying weapons they had been firing at Japanese positions that morning, began the work of tending to prisoners. They established aid stations. They distributed K-rations, carefully, knowing that bodies adapted to starvation cannot process rich food without medical supervision. Armed. They rigged generators to provide electric light for the first time in 14 months. They carried water. This is where the gasping happened. It was not a single moment, but a repeated pattern, witnessed by dozens of prisoners and recorded in their testimonies. An American soldier would see a woman struggling with a water bucket. Women still needed to carry water even after liberation. The plumbing remained broken. And he would simply take the bucket from her hands. Not forcefully, not as a command. He would say something like, "Ma'am, let me get that for you," in the same tone he might use to hold a door open back home. Then he would carry the bucket to wherever she indicated, set it down carefully, and walk away to help someone else. The women gasped. They stared. Some wept. To understand why this gesture caused such reaction, you must understand what they had learned over 3 years of captivity. They had learned that men with power do not voluntarily relinquish it, even in gestures. They had learned that assistance always comes with obligation. They had learned that the strong do not serve the weak. The strong command, the weak endure. They had learned most fundamentally that the social order is fixed and that attempting to alter it brings punishment. The Japanese guards had never carried water for prisoners. To do so would have violated the fundamental hierarchy that separated captors from captive. When prisoners struggled with loads too heavy for their malnourished bodies, the guards watched. Sometimes they laughed. Sometimes they struck prisoners who moved too slowly, but they never helped. Helping would have implied equality. Helping would have suggested that the prisoner's burden was unjust. Helping would have cracked the ideological foundation that made the camps possible. The American soldiers carried water because they had been raised in a culture that, however imperfectly applied, however often betrayed in practice, contained a foundational myth of egalitarianism. They had been taught from childhood that all men are created equal. They had absorbed, often unconsciously, the democratic ideal that power should serve rather than dominate. They came from a nation where the frontier ethos dictated that neighbors helped neighbors raise barns, where labor was dignified rather than degrading, where a man's worth was measured partly by his willingness to assist those in need. This is not to claim that American society in 1945 was free of hierarchy, discrimination, or injustice. The same army that liberated Santo Tomas remained racially segregated. The same democracy that proclaimed equality denied full citizenship to African Americans, denied property rights to women in many states, denied entry to refugees fleeing fascism. The contradiction between American ideals and American reality was vast and often brutal, but ideas have power independent of their inconsistent application. The idea that all people possess inherent dignity, that this dignity does not derive from rank or race or gender, but from simple humanity, this idea, however imperfectly honored, was embedded in the cultural DNA of these young soldiers. When they saw someone struggling, helping was not a political act. It was reflexive. It was what decent people did. The Japanese soldiers guarding Santo Tomas had been equally shaped by their cultural context. Bushido, the way of the warrior, emphasized loyalty, honor, and acceptance of death over surrender. But it also enshrined hierarchy as sacred. The samurai served the Lord served the shogun served the emperor. This vertical structure was not oppressive in the Japanese understanding. It was the natural order, the proper arrangement of all relationships. Each person had their place. Maintaining that place was honorable. Attempting to rise above it was chaos. Prisoners in this worldview had forfeited their place by surrendering. They existed in a liminal space beyond the ordered hierarchy. They were not servants because servants had roles and obligations and protections within the system. They were simply defeated, stripped of context, unworthy of the consideration one might give to even the lowest servant. Helping them carried no honor. It was simply incomprehensible. Staff Sergeant Margaret Nash, a nurse from Sacramento who had been imprisoned at Santo Tomas since January 1942, recorded in her diary the moment she understood that liberation was not merely a change of guards, but a different universe of assumptions. She was standing near the Central Plaza on February 4th, the morning after liberation, watching American soldiers distribute supplies. A young private, couldn't have been more than 19, she wrote, was carrying a crate of canned milk to the makeshift hospital area. The crate was clearly heavy. As he walked past, he saw Nash standing with an empty bucket she had been about to fill. He stopped, set down his crate, took her bucket, said, "I'll get this filled for you, ma'am. You just wait right here," and jogged off toward the water distribution point. Nash wrote, "I stood there like a fool with tears running down my face, and I couldn't have explained why to save my life. It wasn't that he got me water. We'd been getting water ourselves for 3 years. It was the ma'am. It was the assumption that I was a person whose time and effort mattered. It was the fact that he interrupted his own task to assist me with mine, as if my need carried equal weight to his duty." I had forgotten this was possible. I had forgotten that men could be like this. The bucket, that simple utilitarian object, galvanized steel with a wire handle, became the symbol through which two incompatible worldviews collided. The Japanese guards had used the bucket as a tool of degradation. Fill your bucket, carry your bucket, spill your water, and you will not get more until tomorrow. The bucket represented the prisoner's status. You exist to perform tasks we do not wish to perform, and you perform them alone, without assistance, because helping you would dignify your existence. The American soldiers transformed the bucket into something else. When they carried it for prisoners, they were making an unconscious statement: "Your burden is visible to me, and I have the power to ease it, therefore I will." This was not mercy. Mercy implies that the giver is superior and chooses to be generous. This was something more radical. This was equality expressed through action. This was the demonstration that power could be deployed horizontally rather than vertically. The testimonies collected after Santo Tomas's liberation contain variations of the same moment, repeated across different prisoners, different soldiers, different days. The pattern is consistent. A prisoner performs a task. An American soldier intercedes without being asked. The prisoner experiences shock, disbelief, then a complex emotional cascade that mixes gratitude with grief. Grief for the years when such simple kindness was absent, grief for the self that had adapted to cruelty and forgotten that alternatives existed. Private First Class. James Morrison from the 1st Cavalry Division wrote to his sister in March 1945 after the camp had been fully secured and most prisoners evacuated for medical treatment. "They thanked us like we'd done something heroic, but all we did was treat them like people. I carried some water buckets. I helped fix a roof. I shared my rations. This is what you do when you see someone who needs help. The crazy thing is they acted like no one had done anything like this for them in 3 years. What kind of men were guarding this place that carrying a damn bucket seemed like a miracle?" Morrison's bewilderment reveals the chasm between military cultures. To him, offering assistance was baseline human decency, the minimum standard of behavior. To the Japanese guards he replaced, offering assistance would have been a category error, like trying to shake hands with a shadow. The prisoners existed in a different moral universe where the rules of reciprocal obligation did not apply. This philosophical gap had lethal consequences throughout the Pacific War. Japanese treatment of prisoners of war was systematically brutal, not because individual guards were unusually sadistic, though some certainly were, but because the entire structure of military honor made protecting prisoner welfare incomprehensible. The death marches, the forced labor, the medical experiments, the casual executions, these were not aberrations from Japanese military culture. They were expressions of it. American forces were not innocent of war crimes. They too committed atrocities. They too sometimes treated enemy combatants and civilians with shocking cruelty. But the American military as an institution maintained, however imperfectly, a framework that recognized prisoner rights. The Geneva Conventions were taught, however cursorily, to American soldiers. Military law included provisions for prosecuting soldiers who abused prisoners. The assumption, again, honored more in theory than in consistent practice, was that even enemies retained certain inviolable human rights. By the time Santo Tomas was liberated, approximately 2,100 of the camp's prisoners required immediate hospitalization for malnutrition, tropical diseases, and injuries sustained during captivity. 16 died in the first week after liberation, their bodies too damaged to recover even with medical intervention. The survivors faced months of rehabilitation. Many would never fully recover. The physical damage was immense. But the testimonies focus, again and again, not on the food or medicine, crucial as those were. They focus on moments of recognition, on being addressed as ma'am or sir, on having doors held open, on soldiers removing their helmets when entering the women's barracks, a gesture of respect that made several prisoners weep, on the bucket carrying. Helen Bray, imprisoned at age 29 and liberated at 32, gave an oral history interview in 1978 as part of a university project documenting prisoner experiences. She described in detail the deprivations, the hunger, the disease, the constant fear of execution that shadowed the camp's final months as Japanese forces retreated through Manila. Then the interviewer asked what she remembered most vividly about the first days after liberation. Bray was silent for nearly a minute. Then she said, "A boy? He was just a boy, maybe 20 years old, from somewhere in the Midwest. He had that flat accent. He saw me trying to carry a bucket of water and a sack of rice I'd just been given at the distribution point. I was walking very slowly because if I walked fast, I'd drop something. He came over and he didn't say, 'Let me take that.' He said, 'Ma'am, may I help you with those?' He asked permission. He asked if he could help me. I said yes, and he took the bucket and the sack, and he asked me where I wanted them. I pointed to my barracks, and he carried them there, and he waited while I opened the door, and he carried them inside and set them down gently. Then he asked if there was anything else I needed. I said no. He smiled and said, 'You take care, ma'am,' and he left. I sat down on my cot and I cried for an hour. My roommate thought I was having a breakdown. Maybe I was. But it wasn't sadness. It was recognizing that I had become someone who found basic courtesy miraculous. This recognition echoes through dozens of testimonies. The prisoners had adapted to an environment where dignity was systematically stripped away. They had learned not to expect kindness because expecting and not receiving is more painful than never expecting at all. They had narrowed their hopes to simple survival, another day breathing, another cup of lugao, another night without being selected for the punishment detail. They had become efficient organisms, shedding everything not essential to continuation. The American soldiers reintroduced them to a world where the unnecessary was possible. Where a man might carry your bucket not because it served a strategic purpose, but because carrying things for people who are struggling is what you do in a decent world. The symbolism worked both directions. The American soldiers, too, were transformed by these encounters. Many had spent months in brutal island-hopping campaigns, fighting an enemy that seemed incomprehensibly fanatical, that launched suicide charges and refused surrender even in hopeless situations. They had seen comrades die ugly deaths. They had killed men at close range. They had been hardened by combat into efficient instruments of violence. Then they opened the gates at Santo Tomas and similar camps, Los Baños, Cabanatuan, Baguio, and encountered thousands of their own people reduced to walking skeletons. The rage was incandescent. Letters home from the period crackle with fury at what had been done to these prisoners. But the fury was channeled most immediately into care, into carrying buckets and distributing food and rigging showers and finding clean clothes and doing the 1,000 small tasks required to restore human dignity to people systematically dehumanized. The contrast was stark and deliberate. Where Japanese military culture expressed hierarchy through domination, American military culture, at its aspirational best, expressed strength through service. This was the democratic ideal operationalized. Power exists to protect and serve, not to extract and control. The reality often fell short of the ideal. But the ideal itself had force. It shaped behavior. It created expectations. First Lieutenant Carolyn Wilkins, an Army nurse assigned to the medical team at Santo Tomas immediately after liberation, wrote in a letter dated February 15, 1945, about the challenge of treating patients who had been traumatized not only physically but psychologically. Many prisoners, she noted, flinched when soldiers approached them, even American soldiers clearly identified and known to be liberators. The reflex to fear men in uniform had been beaten into them over 3 years. It took time to unlearn. Wilkins described one elderly woman, a missionary who had spent 40 years in the Philippines, who refused to eat the K rations offered to her. She kept trying to save them, hiding cans under her mattress for later because the concept of abundance, of more food tomorrow, was incomprehensible after 3 years of calculated scarcity. Wilkins had to sit with her, eating a K-ration herself, demonstrating that food was plentiful, that eating today would not mean starving tomorrow. The water buckets continued to circulate. Soldiers kept carrying them, unaware that these small gestures had become legendary within the prisoner population. Women would point out soldiers who had helped them, creating informal networks of gratitude. That corporal got me water yesterday. That sergeant helped me carry my things to the hospital. The soldiers' names were often unknown. They moved too quickly, there were too many of them, the chaos of liberation made formal introductions impossible. But they were remembered by their actions. In the weeks after liberation, as the military government established order and began processing prisoners for evacuation, a strange cultural moment occurred. American soldiers and liberated prisoners created a hybrid community, temporary but intense, where the normal rules were suspended. Soldiers ate meals with prisoners, sharing rations and stories. Prisoners taught soldiers Tagalog phrases. Soldiers organized entertainment. One tank crew rigged a projector and showed films against the side of a barracks. Someone found a baseball and a bat, and impromptu games materialized in the camp courtyard. The Japanese guards, confined now in a corner of the camp pending war crimes investigations, watched this with expressions that survivors described as bewildered. They had ruled through fear and hierarchy. They were watching a system organized through cooperation and informal reciprocity. It made no sense within their framework. Where was the order? Where were the ranks? Why were officers laughing with enlisted men? Why were soldiers serving prisoners? The answer was embedded in centuries of different historical development. American democracy, born from Enlightenment ideals and frontier pragmatism, had created a culture that, however imperfectly, valued horizontal relationships. Japanese militarism, emerging from feudal structures and Meiji modernization, had created a culture that valued vertical integration and sacrifice to the collective embodied in the emperor. Neither system was pure. American democracy contained vast injustices. Japanese military culture contained moments of genuine honor and self-sacrifice. But the systems produced different reflexes when faced with human suffering. The American reflex, shaped by democratic idealism, was to alleviate suffering when possible. The Japanese reflex, shaped by hierarchical absolutism, was to ignore suffering that occurred outside one's immediate circle of obligation. The bucket, still that same galvanized steel bucket, dented now from years of use, its handle wrapped in cloth strips to protect hands, moved through the camp in soldiers' hands. It became a metonym for liberation, for the specific flavor of American power in that moment. The power to destroy cities with firebombs and atomic weapons, yes, but also the power to notice that an old woman was struggling and to interrupt one's own tasks to ease that struggle. Private Morrison, in another letter to his sister dated March 20th, 1945, tried to explain what the liberation felt like. You think war is about the big stuff, the battles and the strategies and the politics, and it is, don't get me wrong. We fought hard to get here. We lost men taking Manila. But then you walk into a place like this and you realize the war is also about buckets of water. It's about whether you live in a world where a strong man helps a weak woman or a world where he walks past her. We're fighting for the bucket-carrying world. Sounds stupid when I write it like that. But it's true. It was not stupid. It was perhaps the most precise summary of the ideological war that underlay the military conflict. The Axis powers, Germany, Italy, Japan, had constructed philosophies that celebrated hierarchy, strength, racial superiority, and the subjugation of the weak to the will of the strong. The Allied powers, for all their own failures and contradictions, opposed this with an alternative vision. That human dignity was universal, that power created obligation rather than privilege, that civilization was measured by how it treated its most vulnerable members. By late February 1945, most of the Santo Tomas prisoners had been evacuated to hospitals in Leyte and eventually to the United States for long-term care. The camp was converted into a processing center for other operations. The buckets remained stacked now in orderly rows in the supply depot, waiting to be used by the next group of soldiers. The next group of people who needed water carried from one place to another. The liberation of the camps did not end the war. American forces would fight for 5 more months across the Pacific, suffering casualties as Japanese resistance grew more desperate. The firebombing of Japanese cities would kill hundreds of thousands. The atomic bombs would incinerate Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Victory, when it came in August 1945, was purchased at enormous cost. But the liberation of camps like Santo Tomas mattered beyond military strategy. These liberations revealed what the war was actually about. Not territory or resources or even revenge, though all these played roles. The war was about which version of human organization would prevail. The version that saw hierarchy as natural and immutable, or the version that saw equality as aspirational and worth fighting for. The women who gasped when soldiers carried their buckets understood this intuitively. They were not gasping at physical relief, though relief was real. They were gasping at recognition, at the sudden restoration of a status they had been taught to forget, the status of person, of someone whose burden mattered, whose dignity deserved respect, whose struggle called forth assistance not because she had earned it, but because she was human and humans help each other. This is what made the gesture radical. Not the physical act of lifting a bucket, but the assumption embedded in the gesture, that her need was sufficient reason, that no further justification was required, that the universe was arranged such that the strong assist the weak not to establish dominance, but to create community. The Japanese military never understood this. In their framework, such behavior was not noble but weak. Soldiers who carried buckets for prisoners were failing to maintain proper hierarchy. They were contaminating the purity of rank with misguided sentimentality. This was why Japan treated its enemies with such brutality, not because Japanese soldiers were inherently cruel, but because cruelty to the defeated was the logical outcome of a philosophy that equated surrender with permanent dishonor. The testimonies from Santo Tomas often include a curious detail. Many prisoners reported that in the first days after liberation, they felt guilty for feeling happy. They were surrounded by evidence of suffering, their own damaged bodies, friends who had died, years stolen from them. Guilt seemed more appropriate than joy, but joy kept breaking through anyway, in unexpected moments. When someone addressed them politely, when a soldier shared his cigarettes, when clean water ran from a newly repaired tap, when buckets were carried by someone else's hands. The guilt, psychologists later explained, came from survivor's instinct. The joy came from recognition that the abnormal world of the camps was ending, that the normal world, where people treated each other with basic decency, still existed and they were rejoining it. Lieutenant Wilkins, the army nurse, wrote about this in her journal. They apologize for crying. They apologize for being hungry. They apologize for needing help. We have to keep telling them that needing help is normal, that crying is normal, that hunger after years of starvation is the most normal thing in the world. They have been trained to believe that needing anything is shameful. Undoing that training will take longer than healing their bodies. She was right. Many survivors carried psychological scars for decades. Some never spoke about their captivity, finding the memories too painful to articulate. Others spoke compulsively, needing to testify that such things had happened, that the world should know, that forgetting would be betrayal of those who did not survive. The bucket appears in many of these testimonies, always with a quality of amazement that such a simple object could carry such weight. Margaret Nash, the nurse from Sacramento, kept one of the buckets when the camp was finally decommissioned. She brought it home to California. It sat in her garage for 30 years. When she died in 1975, her daughter found it and almost threw it away. It was just an old rusted bucket, seemingly worthless. But Nash had left a note taped to the handle. This bucket was carried by an American soldier when I had forgotten that men did such things. Keep it. The daughter donated it to a museum. It sits now in a collection of artifacts from the Pacific War, displayed next to uniforms and weapons and medals. Museum visitors walk past it, usually without pausing. It is just a bucket. But the placard next to it tells the story, compressed, simplified, but essentially accurate. It explains that this bucket represents the moment when ideology became gesture, when political philosophy was expressed through the simple act of lifting weight from someone else's hands. The Japanese soldiers who guarded Santo Tomas, those who survived the war and returned to a defeated Japan, carried their own trauma. They returned to a nation that had embraced militarism and lost everything. Their emperor, whom they had been taught was divine, announced his humanity in a radio broadcast that many soldiers initially refused to believe was real. Their entire framework collapsed. Some of these former guards were prosecuted for war crimes. Some returned to civilian life and never spoke of their service. A few, in memoirs published decades later, attempted to explain their actions. They wrote about duty and honor. They wrote about following orders. They wrote about the belief that they were building a greater Asia free from Western colonialism. They rarely wrote about the prisoners, and when they did, it was with a curious absence of recognition, as if the prisoners had been abstract problems rather than individual humans. This absence is revealing. The inability to see prisoners as fully human was not a failure of individual empathy. It was the successful operation of a system designed to create that blindness. The guards had been taught that rank determined worth, that surrender negated personhood, that hierarchy was sacred. They followed their teaching faithfully. The result was suffering on an industrial scale. The American soldiers who carried buckets at Santo Tomas went home to a nation that celebrated them as heroes. They had won the war. They had liberated the oppressed. They returned to ticker tape parades and grateful embraces and the GI Bill that would fund their educations and home purchases and launch the great American middle-class expansion of the post-war era. Many of them downplayed their role. "We just did what anyone would do," they said in interviews decades later. "We treated people like people." This modesty was genuine, but it revealed a profound truth. They could not imagine doing otherwise. The reflexes that made them carry buckets were so deeply embedded that they seemed like common sense rather than ideological commitment. This is how culture operates, not through conscious decision-making, but through unconscious reflex. The American soldiers had internalized democratic values so thoroughly that they expressed them automatically when faced with human need. This was the victory that mattered most. Not the military triumph, crucial as that was, but the demonstration that a society organized around egalitarian principles produced men who carried buckets without being ordered to, who saw suffering and moved to alleviate it, who treated dignity as universal rather than earned. The epilogue to Santo Tomas's story extends across decades. The survivors scattered across the globe. Some returned to the Philippines after recovery, unable to imagine living elsewhere despite their trauma. Some settled in the United States, starting new lives and raising families who would grow up knowing their parents had survived something incomprehensible. Some never recovered, their bodies or minds too broken by captivity to fully heal. They held reunions, gatherings where survivors could speak their truth to people who understood, who had been there, who did not need suffering explained because they had lived it. At these reunions, stories circulated. The stories were often about small things. The first real meal after liberation, the first hot shower, the first letter from home confirming that family still existed and still loved them, and always the stories about buckets, about soldiers who carried water, about the moment they understood that liberation meant more than military victory. It meant rejoining a world where basic human kindness was possible. Margaret Nash, before her death, gave an interview to a local newspaper in Sacramento. The reporter asked what she wanted people to understand about her experience. Nash was quiet for a long moment, then said, "People think war is about weapons and tactics, and it is. But it's also about buckets. It's about whether you build a world where people help each other or a world where people exploit each other. We were in the exploitation world for 3 years. Then American soldiers showed up and carried our buckets, and we remembered there was another way to live. That's what we were fighting for." The bucket-carrying world. The phrase caught on in veteran circles. The bucket-carrying world. It became shorthand for the values they believed they had fought to preserve. Not just democracy in the abstract, not just freedom in the political sense, but the practical everyday reality of a society where power created obligation to serve rather than opportunity to dominate. This ideal was tested repeatedly in the decades after 1945. America failed it often. The civil rights movement had to fight for basic equality that should have been guaranteed. The Vietnam War revealed that American power could be deployed brutally and without wisdom. Economic inequality created vast gulfs between rich and poor. The ideal of the bucket-carrying world remained aspirational, honored in rhetoric but betrayed in practice. Yet the ideal persisted. It persisted because men like Private Morrison had written letters home describing it. It persisted because women like Margaret Nash had testified to its power. It persisted because the liberation of Santo Tomas and camps like it had demonstrated that ideas have consequences, that philosophy shapes action, that the choice between hierarchy and equality plays out in gestures as small as carrying water. The bucket itself, that original artifact now in a museum collection, shows its history in layers. The rust, the dents, the cloth wrapped around the handle, now stiff with age. The metal is thin in places where years of use wore it down. It was built to be utilitarian, to perform a function and nothing more. It became something else through the hands that held it. First, the hands of prisoners, women whose bodies were wasting away, but who gripped the handle and carried water because not carrying water meant death. The bucket was burden then, the daily evidence of their powerlessness. Then the hands of American soldiers, young men who saw someone struggling and reached out without thinking, who took the handle and lifted the weight and carried it to wherever it needed to go. The bucket was service then. The physical manifestation of values that said all people deserve dignity. The transformation was complete. The same object, the same basic function, moving water from here to there, but entirely different meaning depending on who carried it and why. This is the lesson of Santo Tomas. Context determines meaning. Philosophy determines action. The choice between cruelty and kindness, between hierarchy and equality, between domination and service plays out every day in gestures so small they seem trivial. They are not trivial. They are everything. January 17th, 1945. Santo Tomas Internment Camp. A woman grips a bucket handle with both hands. She is skeletal, exhausted, defeated. She prepares to carry 40 pounds of water across mud that will suck at her feet, to a barracks where others wait, to another day of endurance. February 4th, 1945. The same camp transformed. An American soldier sees her struggling. He reaches for the handle. "Ma'am, let me get that for you." He carries the bucket. She gasps. In that gasp lives the sound of a world realigning, of recognizing that cruelty is not inevitable, that hierarchy is not natural law, that power can choose to serve rather than subjugate. In that gasp is the reason why ideas matter, why philosophy is not abstract but immediate, why the choice between democratic equality and authoritarian hierarchy determines whether buckets are tools of domination or gestures of care. The war continued for months after Santo Tomas. More blood was shed, more cities burned, more lives were shattered. But in that camp, in that moment, with that bucket, the outcome was already clear. Not the military outcome that still hung in balance, still required sacrifice and courage and terrible cost, but the moral outcome. The demonstration that a society organized around human dignity produced men who carried buckets for strangers, while a society organized around rigid hierarchy produced men who watched suffering and called it discipline. The women who gasped understood. They had lived in both worlds. They had endured the hierarchy world and nearly died there. They had been pulled back into the dignity world by men who barely knew them but helped them anyway. The gasp was recognition. The gasp was relief. The gasp was the sound of rejoining the human community after 3 years in exile from it. The bucket waits in its museum case, rust-scarred, battered, unremarkable, but it carried water when water meant life. And it was carried by hands that proved democracy is not just a system of government, but a way of being in the world, a way that sees suffering and responds with assistance, that sees hierarchy and chooses equality, that sees a bucket too heavy for thin hands, and reaches out without thinking to share the weight. This is what we fought for. This is what victory meant. Not just the defeat of armies, but the preservation of a world where buckets are carried by those who can, for those who cannot. Because that is what decent people do in a decent world. The women gasped because they had forgotten such a world existed. The soldiers carried buckets because they could not imagine a world where they would do otherwise. Between these two responses, the gasp of disbelief and the shrug of obvious action, lies the entire meaning of the war.